Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Research in Action webinar. This is issue number 6 about school-based mentoring. You're hearing April Reardon. I'm the Director of Training and Community Partnerships for the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota. I know we have lots more people who are signed up and going to be joining us in these first few minutes, but we want to go ahead and get started on time so we have a lot to cover during this hour for this particular webinar. We do have Dr. Michael Karcher and Dr. Carla Herrera participating in the webinar with us, so thank you to them for being here, and we're going to get through the overview and be able to ask questions and hear from them. So also especially for our Minnesota programs, but really for anybody, the Minnesota Mentoring Conference is October 19th, and we are also have the pleasure of having Dr. Karcher as our keynote presenter, and he'll also be doing 2 workshops, including one focusing on school-based mentoring. So if you don't get enough from this webinar, be sure to register for the conference. A few instructions here, just so you know that we have enough people, so many people registered for this particular webinar that we can't just leave it open and have everybody control their own audio. Because we have a limited number of spots available through the GoToWebinar system for that. So what we will do is, if you have a comment or a question that you'd like to submit or ask, there are a couple of options. You can type your questions. There's a spot where you can submit those questions, and we have our Promise Fellow, Lindsay Carlson, on the webinar again to manage those questions, so she'll see when those are there and be sure to ask those on your behalf. The other option is that there is a spot where there's a little hand and you can raise your hand, and Lindsay will keep an eye on those and let us know if somebody has their hand raised. Then she can unmute you, because right now everybody is muted, so we can't hear you, and that way we don't have some echo and different background noise. So she can unmute you, and then you can just ask your question. So don't be shy about that. We're more than happy to do that. We get a lot of questions submitted typed, but would love to hear your voices as well so that we can hear from that. You should be able to see the attendee list and see who else is there participating. So feel free to use the chat function to ask questions of each other as well, or kind of use their name and let them know. And I see that we already have a question, so that's good, and we'll save those for a little bit later, but yeah, feel free to type in your questions at any point. Really, what we want the overview to do and presenting the research and action brief to do is to trigger that discussion for later. So I know many of you have participated in previous webinars, but for those of you who might be new for this particular webinar, just knowing that this is based on Mentor's Research and Action series. They have that the National Mentoring Partnership has a Research and Policy Council that convened and then pulled together these 10 research and action issues. So we're more than halfway through the 10. So we've gone through issues 1 through 5 already, and many of you have participated in those webinars, and so now we're on to issue 6, and we'll continue through issue 10, and then hopefully we'll just venture out of the research and action issues and continue doing webinars about other current research in the mentoring field. The way that the research and action briefs are set up, if you haven't seen them yet, is that it's a really kind of a brief peer-reviewed article written by these leading researchers like Dr. Karcher and Herrera, and just summarizing research available on the topic. And then they provide this action section, which could be tools or activities. In this case, it's a quiz, some quizzes about how is school-based mentoring the right program for you, and another one about are you using the best practices, or sort of just checking out how well you're doing with your school-based mentoring. So it's kind of a fun quiz. And then a list of all sorts of additional resources for you. And so the webinar kind of follows the same thing, that we'll review the research that was presented. And again, hopefully that can just trigger some discussion for later. And then the dialogue is really our action portion of the webinar. So we can, how are you incorporating these research findings, or what are some of your thoughts about it? And hopefully we'll share resources. And we have resources within the webinar itself, or within the PowerPoint. So again, we've got school-based mentoring. We've got Michael Karcher. Those of us in Minnesota know that we've done a poll to see if we prefer the cowboy hat look, or bow tie, or just suit and tie look, and our Minnesotans have decidedly chosen the cowboy hat. So it shows that photo here. And we also have Dr. Carla Herrera with Public-Private Ventures. So glad to have them participating with us, but they are the authors of this particular brief. Okay. Oops. So the way that this particular brief was laid out was looking at approaches to mentoring, some of the outcomes that we see from school-based mentoring, characteristics of effective programs, and then we'll get into our discussion. One interesting thing to note, and I'll continue to note this throughout the presentation when it comes up, but I've added a couple things, or some slides, or things that aren't necessarily in Mentor's research and action brief, because we wanted to include the Department of Education's impact study of its student mentoring program. So we will look a little bit at that research too, which is another reason why we want to try to move through this overview and get to hearing from our researchers. So, all right, so school-based mentoring, we know, is now, according to a national poll conducted by Mentor in 2006, is now the most common form of formal mentoring in the U.S., with this close to 870,000 adults mentoring children in schools. And what's interesting is that this estimate does not include any of the high school age volunteers currently mentoring in schools. So if we included that number, clearly it would go up higher. And so what we're going to be looking at, there are recent studies that outline some of the school-based mentoring models' strengths and challenges. So, looking at the conclusions that school-based mentoring is a very different intervention from the traditional community-based mentoring model. And also really highlighting that the approach does benefit the participating youth, and that several practices may be crucial for maximizing those benefits. So some of the pieces about the school-based mentoring versus community-based mentoring. So what are some of the approaches to mentoring? That some of the strengths of school-based mentoring can be that there are more supervised matches at the school, and that's not typically utilized in community-based mentoring because they are on-site. And also looking at that high school and college-age mentors who might need additional structure of the school, that school context or that on-site supervision, that those groups of mentors might be more likely to be used in school-based mentoring. There's also this sort of, I summarize as reaching some underserved children, but because oftentimes in school-based mentoring, teachers nominate students for the program, then school-based mentoring can reach children whose parents might not have the resources to seek out mentoring services for their children. School-based mentoring also offers some opportunities to really influence school-related outcomes. We've seen some things, and this is from that mentors' presence may provide youth an incentive to come to school more often, or a disincentive to misbehave. And as Dr. Herrera had mentioned in the 1999 study, school-based mentors may even become a voice or advocate for the child at school. And then you see in the strengths of school-based mentoring that school-based mentoring often occurs in the presence of peers. And so I have that on both sides as a strength and a challenge. because we don't really know, or there's a little bit of both, where it can enhance the mentoring relationship by providing insights into social skills and relationships, or opportunities to help the child with their peer relationships. The child's peers might observe the child being valued and appreciated by a mentor, which is something that could help with those relationships. But there's also some things that we'll talk about later that could inhibit the match by having the peers present, depending on the age of the mentee. So some of the challenges of school-based mentoring: we've got limited time. The school setting there are a lot of constraints about class schedules, and so they might have shorter meeting times as well as a shorter match, or the duration of the relationship could be shorter. We'll see that school-based mentoring matches usually don't get started right away. It takes a little while in the school year for them to get matched. So really, the length of the relationship isn't even the full school year. And we often have that pause of the relationship during any kind of school break, and particularly in the summer. Some of the challenges too would be it kind of limits on the types of activities available. Oftentimes school-based mentoring, has far fewer opportunities for playful activities, and looking at that more, the opportunities to do the kinds of activities that might contribute to community-based mentoring success. So they don't get to connect to the surrounding community as much, or get to know their home environment and things like that. And again, we've got this presence of the peers can be a challenge for school-based mentoring as well. This is a part of this particular brief that I thought was interesting to note then too, about the costs for school-based mentoring and community-based mentoring. And looking at, so the costs are similar at about $1,000 per match per year, and that's citing Dr. Herrera in 2007. But that looking at the variation across programs, and so sometimes people opt to do, or organizations will opt to do school-based mentoring under this assumption that school-based mentoring might be cheaper or is less expensive because it is site-based, or there might be, and because it's site-based and supervised, there might be less screening or things like that. But really, when determining the program's value, we're looking at those costs to be weighed with the type of service being provided and the population that's being served. There's an example here. So the youth and school-based mentoring programs might receive much. We talked about that they have a shorter duration, or their meetings are shorter, they meet less frequently. The relationship might have those pauses, so they might receive less mentoring per dollar per year. So despite the similar annual cost, school-based mentoring actually becomes a more expensive program per hour. And that the suggestion here is that considering the outcomes yielded for a given program is likely a better strategy when thinking about what's the value of different types of mentoring. So speaking of outcomes, so we've mentioned this meta-analysis many times in the previous Research in Action webinars, but looking at the meta-analysis found similarly small effects for school-based mentoring, community-based mentoring, and other types of mentoring programs, because I was looking at 55 mentoring program effectiveness studies. And also results from several studies since then suggest that school-based mentoring does provide benefits that are comparable in size to those achieved in community-based mentoring. So, and those benefits, we're looking at school performance, attitudes, behavior, as well as peer relationships. And what we'll do is we're going to look at, and this is where I'll certainly, since we've got them here, I've got some slides. So we'll look at the Big Brothers Big Sisters study. Also looking at the Communities in Schools SMILE impact study that Dr. Karcher did, and the first one would be with Dr. Herrera and Public-Private Ventures. And then we'll sneak in a little bit of this impact evaluation of the Department of Education Student Mentoring Program, which, just so nobody's confused, that's not in the actual mentor research and action brief because it came out after these were published, but wanted to make sure to include that. So with the Big Brothers Big Sisters study, so this was Dr. Herrera in 2007, we're looking at, it involved 10 Big Brothers Big Sisters agencies, and over 1,000 youth in grades 4 through 9, looking at other inputs there about the, what was the economic level, or most were in single-parent homes or having 77% having difficulties. But again, looking at this average of 5 months of weekly mentoring. So how much mentoring was going into it. And then to see on the right side in the yellow box that these are some of the outcomes then that are shown from the Big Brothers Big Sisters school-based mentoring impact study, that mentored youth improved more than non-mentored peers in school performance and behavior. They're more confident in scholastic abilities, and that the size of the benefits was modest against the small effect sizes, but almost identical to that reported for the community-based, the Big Brothers Big Sisters community-based mentoring. The difference being that the Big Brothers Big Sisters school-based mentoring benefited youth in only school-related outcomes. So looking at some of these confident in scholastic abilities or school performance and behavior, but that the community-based mentoring affected a much broader set of outcomes. So things like initiation of drug and alcohol use or parent relationships. And then what's interesting too is that this particular, the Big Brothers Big Sisters school-based mentoring evaluation included a 6-month follow-up assessment to test the durability of those changes, and most of the school-based mentoring outcomes were not sustained into the first half of the second school year of the study. So that was when about half of the youth were no longer receiving mentoring, and so thinking about how sustainable are the effects of school-based mentoring. And I can just see here if Dr. Herrera, if you have anything that you'd like to.
I think that's a really good summary. I don't really have anything to add to it. I think you did a good job.
Okay, just to make sure. And we're going to talk more about kind of who benefits the most and get into a little deeper into some of those studies, but that's sort of the overview. So the next study here would be the Communities in Schools study of mentoring in the learning environment, or the SMILE impact study, and that's where we have Dr. Karcher. So again, on the left side, the sort of tan box, you can kind of see what went into it, so randomly assigned. Something to note about this study is that it was that students were assigned to a mentor in addition to supportive services, so looking at who's going to benefit from supportive services alone or supportive services plus school-based mentoring. So it's a multi-component intervention by Communities in Schools of San Antonio. So looking at this additive effect of providing a school-based mentor, so some of those other services might be tutoring or group counseling or other activities. And that the duration of these relationships was also brief, but it says typically 8 meetings across 3 months. And citing that, barriers to retaining mentors is getting in the way of having longer relationships. But that said, even with those inputs, so looking at the yellow side here, that those youth who did receive a mentor reported self-reported connectedness to peers and self-esteem, improved self-esteem. but did not find impacts in other areas, including grades and attendance. So not as many of those school-based impacts. And that, again, size of the program effects was small. And I'll see, just check here to see if Dr. Karcher, if you want to say.
No, once again, I think you've done a nice job. I guess the only I would highlight is the age range, and that this study is really the only one that has included high school kids for whom we find some negative effects. So the overall impacts can be a little bit diminished by the negative or minimal effects for high school kids.
Okay, and we'll look at, again, we're going to look at that a little bit closer. Okay, so the piece that's not in the mentors research and action brief that I thought I would include here too is the impact evaluation of the United States Department of Ed student mentoring program. So looking at that they looked at 32 school-based mentoring programs, and you know, this is a really brief summary, and we can get into more detail or some more of your questions about how programs were selected and how the study was set up. But 32 school-based programs within the Department of Ed grantees. So looking at 2,500 students, grades 4 through 8. So like Dr. Karcher said, that it's not as wide of an age range because the Department of Ed student mentoring program focuses on those grades 4 through 8. Again, randomly assigned to either treatment or control group, but it didn't mean that the control group couldn't seek mentoring services elsewhere. And then the average length of the relationship was 5.8 months, which was a little bit longer or about comparable to, say, the Big Brothers Big Sisters study, which had somewhat similar age range. And I just pulled out, I think the piece of the outcomes or the thing that we're hearing the most about with the Department of Ed student mentoring program is that they have in bold on the executive summary that the student mentoring program did not lead to statistically significant impacts on students in any of the 3 outcome domains that they were looking for, which were this academic achievement, interpersonal relationships, and then the high risk or delinquent behavior. So, and this executive summary, I do have that listed in your resources section at the end of the PowerPoint as well. So if you happen to have not seen this study yet or heard anything about it, then you can check it out there. Again, I think that at this point, then Dr. Karcher had some things to share with us as well about this particular study.
Sure. Will you be able to put the slide up, or should I just talk about it? April? I guess what I would share with folks, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. In fact, I'm going to talk a lot more about this when I come up in the fall for the conference, and that is what's important to understand about the study is one of the things is that they were encouraged, actually told to use a statistical adjustment to be extra sure that they weren't claiming effects that weren't present. And this is proving to be quite problematic. Mentoring isn't the only study that had its findings erased. What you see coming up once you pass the Big Brother findings, you pass the SMILE findings, now you see the IES findings. And what I would highlight is that when you actually look in Appendix D, you'll find the tests that they ran with the scales as they were made, and then you also see them before they've been adjusted with this very conservative statistical adjustment. And what you find are effects that are not only similar in size to what Carla and her colleagues found with Big Brother Big Sister, they're also in very similar domains. So it seems that despite the fact they said they found nothing, if you look in Appendix D, you'll find that they found virtually the same thing that the Big Brother Big Sister study found. And I think that's a really important point that seems to go undiscussed, and we'll talk more about that in October.
Okay, and I'm sure that will have some more questions then too. Switching between those got me a little goofed up. All right, we'll go back there. All right, so looking at who benefits the most from school-based mentoring, so looking at some of the differences there, and understanding who receives bigger benefits from school-based mentoring, and all of this can be helpful in determining, you know, is school-based mentoring the right intervention or right program for our organization or for our kids, or which youth should receive a school-based mentor. I have that question a lot about, you know, who should we match first, or things like that. So I'd also think about how to just improve those services for different groups of youth. So knowing that the age of mentees can make a big difference in the benefits seen from school-based mentoring, as well as gender and other characteristics of mentees. Compared to peers who received other support services alone, so in the SMILE study, the elementary school Latino boys and high school Latina girls benefited the most. And we also have high school girls reporting greater connectedness to culturally different peers and self-esteem and support from friends. And looking at, too, the impact, we'll talk about this impact of peers. You know, kind of the most important thing that rang true for me about this particular section was that this point about that not all youth are going to benefit in the same ways. And, you know, having looked at this Department of Ed study or some of those results, and hearing some of the programs that we're talking to here in Minnesota, and what they're struggling with is just that, you know, because not all youth benefit in the same ways doesn't necessarily mean that programs should stop serving those youth, or, you know, but rather that program staff may have to think about adapting the program model, or what can we do differently to fill the needs of youth who are not getting as much from their participation as we would hope they would. You know, so speaking of gender then too, this is on the left side there's a quote. I was at the Summer Institute for Youth Mentoring, and I know in my last summer and in my notes I had this quote from Dr. Karcher bolded and highlighted, but just looking at the fact that sitting at a table in a high school cafeteria and talking with a boy about his problems in front of his peers is just not a good way to go. So kind of put that in perspective. I'm going to go back to Dr. Karcher. I've got a couple more of his slides here to look at some of the variation with the SMILE study between looking at gender and age.
So this is a nicely confusing table, and it's the one in the article, which I'd be glad to email anybody if they want to write to me. I'll send them this article. But what you see is is girls on the left and boys on the right, and the columns that have hash marks in them, those are the kids who received mentoring. And the colors are the different grade levels. So white is elementary, turquoise is middle school, and then dark blue is high school. So on the left side, you see the only impact on connectedness to school was the boost that the girls got in high school. That's the dark blue columns. If you shift over to the males, you see the biggest impact really is this difference between the white columns for the elementary boys. But of concern to me is this blue column for the high school boys, where the high school boys who were mentored were lower in connectedness to school, and they were significantly lower in connectedness to teachers after being mentored. And I guess to follow up on the quote that April just shared, one of the problems was that the older the kids got, the more likely the mentors and the male mentors were to sort of stay on problems and academics, and really not, I think, to sort of subvert perhaps the relationship in an effort to try and keep the kid from dropping out. And I think that's where the problem focus is the biggest, and so we see some negative effects in this table. And that's what you're seeing here as well. It's also worth noting that the very bottom right square where it says same-sex mentors, those high school boys were the only kids who had only boys who had all male mentors. So here clearly is an instance where same-sex mentors doesn't prove to be much more helpful. But I think in the end, the problem was that the content of what the mentors did over time changed such that, and I think the school constrained what they could do, so it wasn't all the mentors' fault. But my take is that the high school boys in particular really are better mentored in the community than they are in the schools, given the pressure to focus on academics in the school.
Okay. Can you hear me now, Lindsay? Okay. We just had a little moment where Lindsay thought we were just checking my audio there for a second. Sorry. Great. That's helpful. And I don't, if we wanted to see if Dr. Herrera, if you had anything to share there. I know that similar things popped up about age groups and gender, and that in the Big Brothers Big Sisters study and the PPV study of Big Brothers Big Sisters, that their excitement about having a mentor, they had significantly less excitement as they progressed from elementary to middle to high school, and that the suggestion that maybe having a mentor may simply mean different things for younger and older youth, or for girls versus boys.
That's true. In our findings in the studies hinted that the kids in middle school were actually getting bigger effects than the kids in elementary school, but what was tricky there was that the middle school youth were almost all matched with adults, whereas the elementary school kids were matched much more often with high school mentors than the middle school kids. And so when we cut things by high school mentor versus adult mentor, we realized that that was probably what was driving those differences. The high school mentors were much less effective than the adults. So our age group analyses were really not as clean as we would have liked them to be. We did see kind of hints at girls getting bigger impacts than boys, but I like the way that Michael split things up more carefully across age groups, because I think just looking at things by gender may hide some of the story.
Okay, and if I go, I'm just going to jump back here a second. So some of the other things about characteristics of mentees that Dr. Herrera and Dr. Karcher both have seen is that that there might be hints that school-based mentoring could be more beneficial for particular groups. And one example was that youth who were performing better academically at the start of their program involvement seemed to benefit slightly more than those who were struggling academically. So maybe that mentors of academically struggling mentees feel compelled to intervene and assist with academics, which may diminish the effectiveness of the mentor. When we're looking at characteristics of effective school-based mentoring programs, or even effective mentors, and some of the things that we've learned in the previous 5 research and action webinars, or things that we've been discussing, are about some of that mentor's approach. And so thinking about if as youth move from elementary to middle to high school, there's this increasing emphasis on academic and behavioral improvements and less on the relationship, that can affect the quality of that relationship and thus the outcomes. And that, there's, I think, in a couple different spots, looking at the risk of having high school students perceive having a mentor as something that's a consequence, or I think another word that was used was remedial, rather than something that's an enhancement, or something that's adding this special adult to their life. So again, just looking at that not all youth benefit the same way, and thinking about who does your school-based mentoring program serve, and are you seeing different results, or are you measuring that? Are you looking at the different results for different kids? And finally, this research brief goes through some characteristics of effective school-based mentoring programs. Some of these things are things that we've talked about in detail with the previous research and action briefs, or things that continue to pop up about effective mentoring programs in general, but really looking at school-based mentoring and what do these things mean to make school-based mentoring have a greater impact. And so mentor support, so training and support from the agency or the organization, just as important in school-based mentoring as it is in community-based mentoring. Dr. Herrera reports that those mentors who reported higher levels of staff support and helpfulness and receipt of more training, both pre-match and ongoing, felt closer to their mentees and were more likely to carry their match over into a subsequent school year. And Dr. Karcher similarly found those who reported more contact with their communities and schools, case managers, felt more important, felt they benefited more from being mentors, viewed their relationships more positively. What's interesting is that in looking at the Department of Education impact study, there were some negative associations with programs where mentors had the most contact with their program staff, that there were some negative results on the impact. So it's kind of interesting to look at. I guess one thing I thought of was, maybe they were having increased contact with their program support staff because they were having trouble with their relationship already, or there's some things in the research brief that talk about that associations between staff and mentors doesn't necessarily mean that receiving support causes positive mentor outcomes. So because there could be a lot of things about this, particularly in the school setting, because the staff are there and they're on site, that their physical presence doesn't necessarily equal support for their mentors, and that if they're not actually interacting with the mentors, then maybe it's not providing the same level of support that, say, a community-based mentoring program staff, then when they have to seek out their mentors to offer that support, that maybe that's perceived somewhat differently. There was a part where 12% of mentors in the Big Brothers Big Sisters study reported that they had never communicated with Big Brothers Big Sisters or school staff for support or advice. So they're on site, they're there, but haven't reported that at all. So there's some other pieces there too about just communication with school staff, and having access to resources and space at the school are also linked with both match quality and longevity. And that, sort of a precursor to even thinking about next month's webinar when we're looking at cross-age peer mentoring with Dr. Karcher again, and that different types of school-based mentors may require different types of support. So thinking about this mentor support piece, and it might be that our high school students or college students or other mentors might need additional support or different types of support from their staff. We mentioned a little bit about types of activities, and we have covered looking at developmental or prescriptive relationships and the approaches of mentors, but thinking about how the school context can invite mentors to focus directly on improving academic performance, and they might become a little more mentor-driven or goal-directed activities, activities that are selected by the mentor and become more instrumental. And we know that those types of activities, or being overly mentor-driven, can impact match quality, where if we're not youth-centered and looking at what are the developmental needs of the youth, that can affect the quality of the relationship. School-based mentors are reporting engaging in academic activities far more frequently, and that this tends to occur at higher rates in later grades. So looking at what Dr. Karcher was talking about the limited effects of school-based mentoring for high school boys in the SMILE study, the percentage of time the boys' mentors spent discussing academics, behavior, and attendance was 3 times greater in high school than it was in elementary school. So this could also explain why high school students in the Big Brothers Big Sisters school-based mentoring study reported being less interested in having a mentor. And again, it's that kind of, if mentoring is seen by the youth more as a consequence for underachievement then as that special opportunity, then it can have a detrimental effect on that relationship. So looking at how do we balance, if we're talking about school-based mentoring and school staff expectations or Department of Education expectations for what the content of those mentoring relationships would be, how do we balance the fun relationship building activities with those things that are academic focused? Because often the outcomes that we're trying to show from school-based mentoring are academic in nature, and thinking about how to balance those or how to make the point that building that relationship first is really important. And I know that's something that comes up again and again when I'm working with programs that are starting school-based mentoring programs. Increasing longevity is an issue. We know that longer, stronger matches are desired, and so some of these issues of how do we get kids matched sooner, how do we make sure that how do we build time into the school day so they could meet longer, how do we enhance programs to add other pieces maybe outside of the school day or extending that. I mean, thinking about all of those different things in order to make those matches longer. And how do we continue those relationships from year to year? So thinking about that aspect of longevity as well, which, looking at the terminating effectively, 1 year matches are kind of the norm in school-based mentoring. And so thinking about, if we can't convince mentors or can't get mentors to continue through the summer and or even come back in the next year, how do we train mentors on the importance of effectively closing matches and making sure that those terminations are clear? I also remember from the Summer Institute last summer that one suggestion that Dr. Karcher made or an idea that was just thrown out was maybe all school-based matches end at the end each year, and then there's no expectation or no unclear expectation of, well, I wonder if my mentor's coming back next year or if they're not, because lots of things can change over the summer. But also, I mean, going back to that Big Brothers Big Sisters study too, and that Big Brothers Big Sisters was able to do that follow-up evaluation 6 months later to see, if we have some outcomes from that first year of school-based mentoring, how do we sustain that into the second year? And then the issue with school-based mentoring, and something that I think school-based mentoring programs have been tackling quite a bit, is how to build in some summer contact. Do you do summer activities, or do you allow matches to stay in touch by phone or letters or email? Some of it is that school-based mentors typically undergo less screening than community-based mentors. So, programs worry about the liability during the summer. And I thought that it was interesting that the Big Brothers Big Sisters study noted that most mentors reported that they wanted to communicate with their mentees during the summer and felt that their mentees did as well, but that it was the program, the agencies, or schools that lacked the ability or commitment, or maybe their own staff capacity, to support summer communication. So thinking about how do we build that in. And finally, just looking at that school-based mentoring programs, we have to adjust to the structure of the school, to think about what kind of mentor training, staff support, what can we do with match maintenance, and thinking about summer contact in order to make school-based mentoring reach its potential. And that thinking about some of those specific needs by gender or age in order to make school-based mentoring work as best as it can. So at this point, we can open up to any questions you have for Dr. Herrera and Dr. Karcher. If you want to share these are just some suggestions, benefits, or constraints that you see in your school-based mentoring program. If you have questions about where the U.S. Department of Education study fits in, and if you haven't looked at your research and action brief or taken the Is Your School-Based Mentoring Program Effective quiz, it's kind of reminds me of taking a quiz in a magazine to find out a little bit more about my personality or something, but to take that quiz and find out where am I at, or how is my program doing, and it can be a good review of some of those characteristics of effective programs as well, or give you some ideas of places where you might be able to improve your program. And I know, Lindsay, that we have one question that's been submitted for a little while, and we can keep an eye out for hands up.
Yeah, we have a few different questions. First is a pretty simple question. It's from Eleanor Farney. Excuse me for butchering your last name. She wants to know how many hours weekly did mentors spend with the mentees in each of the studies that were discussed?
Hi, Eleanor. Were you at the Institute two years ago? Just curious. Oh, Eleanor can't speak. Never mind. I think most of the studies had 1 hour a week as the intended amount of time, but it was a little less than that, given that they didn't meet every week.
Okay, great.
I don't know if I'm muted.
Oh,
You're not.
There you go. Go ahead, Eleanor. Oh.
That was Carla.
Go ahead, Carla.
Oh, I was just saying that's right. It was about an hour a week, a little less than an hour a week, but they met on average a few times a month. So it was less than 4 hours per month.
Okay, great. The next question that we've had for quite a while is from Ginny Babbitt, and she has a question about what liability issues exist in allowing mentor-student contact outside of the school, and is it possible for smaller programs, both in terms of budget and staff, to allow this kind of contact?
Carla?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm not sure. April, you might actually be able to answer that question better than I could. I know that it's a big concern for a lot of agencies. I'm working with Big Brothers Big Sisters of America on an enhanced school-based mentoring model right now, and that was a concern for several of the agencies. But now that they're starting to encourage summer communication, it's less of a concern. They haven't had problems with it. And I think just keeping a very watchful eye on your matches through the summer and making sure that they have that support and you don't kind of just let them run helps. But I'm not really an expert on all the liability stuff.
I think it's very.
Oh, go ahead.
I think it's very difficult because sometimes the schools don't allow the meetings, and then where can the meetings occur? I know Big Brother Big Sisters got sort of a hybrid model that they do here in San Antonio, where they, if mentors want to meet in the summer, they shift them, but when they do that shift, they have to go through an upgraded training, and so they view them as different in their risk.
I think there's a difference between, one of the things that I hear from programs is about just capacity to offer programming outside of the school day. So I'm also thinking summer, we're kind of talking about how do we do that in the summer, but also there's different screening that may be required in order to allow them to have contact outside of school, and that additional staff support and supervision. So, I don't have any hard numbers off the top of my head about how much that would cost, or, but we could certainly, and I'm not sure, Ginny, if you're in Minnesota or another state, but thinking about your mentoring partnership or somebody to talk through what would be the impact for your particular program, and if any other programs have looked into that or have any insight into Jenny's question about maybe what you've experienced with your particular program, that would be the perfect time to share that as well.
I also wanted to note, April, that when contact is allowed, it's contact. It's not seeing the child without being in a supervised setting. So it's writing letters. Some agencies actually screen those letters or those emails through the agency before they'll pass them on, rather than letting the mentor and the mentee communicate directly. But they do, there are a lot of safeguards you can put into place, but it is definitely a concern for a lot of agencies.
All right, so another common
Oh, I'm sorry. Another question that kind of goes along with what we have here in the PowerPoint that's been asked about by a couple of different people is the Department of Ed study. Christopher Reinsma he says he's not totally clear on the purpose of having those additional statistics. And we also have a question from Joseph Radelet about what are the implications from the Department of Ed study using a more conservative methodology. So maybe, Michael, you could speak to how that information adds to what's in the research and action brief, and also speak to the more conservative methodology.
Okay, well, now that I know Joe's on the line, I'm a little nervous here. Well, I would start off by saying, the question is was it a good idea to increase this sort of level of rigor? And my straightforward take is that it was not. And in Education Week a few months ago, Deborah Villadaro, I know I'm mispronouncing that, but she did a summary of programs funded by by IES and studied by IES, the Institute for Educational Sciences, I think, at the Department of Ed. And 7 of 9 programs that had been running for a while, that were rigorously developed, that underwent an evaluation just like the student mentoring program, 7 of 9 found no effects. And that's a statistical improbability, because these are programs that have been well received by communities, that were well run. The likelihood that 7 of 9 would have no effects whatsoever speaks to me more about a methodological problem than it does to the quality of these programs. So there are reasons to want to make sure we don't claim effects that aren't present. But I think when we balance the fact that these programs were very, my brother who used to sell cars would say about cars, they were very hairy. These programs differed a great deal, and all that diversity makes statistics much harder to be clean and neat. So in evaluation, I think there is more risk that you won't find the effects than that you will when there's so much sort of chaotic noise in the data. And I think it was just an overly conservative approach, and it was taken during a time when I think the Department of Ed really wanted to make sure that anything that could possibly be interfering with No Child Left Behind would be identified and sort of put aside.
Well, hopefully that answers that question. Thank you. Another question we have from Christopher is, he says, from what we can tell from the research, what is the range of effect sizes in school-based mentoring, and how does that compare to other intervention types like individual counseling or group counseling, specifically in terms of the effect size?
Carla, can I take this one?
Sure. I can add, but go ahead and start, Michael.
Okay. I train school counselors, and so I teach research methods. Psychotherapy for kids and for adults has an effect size of about 0.8, which means that 0.8 of a standard deviation difference between the treatment and the control group at post-test. Mentoring has about a 0.2. Whether it's in the community, it's a little higher than in schools as we're measuring it now. But in my talk in October, I'm going to present some data that shows that the size of the effect of the mentoring programs, let's say about 0.2 in the schools or 0.15, is very comparable to other after-school programs. And if you want to read up in advance, there's the Cassell report that's available online, study of after-school programs, and they find the same sort of impacts. But they also find, another point that I'll bring up, that the effect sizes grow when you add more best practices. So their programs, their after-school programs, range from 0.15 to 0.30 or 0.40, depending on whether or not they had evidence-based training practices. So in a sense, mentoring is generally about, if you want to make it numerical, about as fourth as effective as having a full course of psychotherapy on some outcomes. But it is comparable to other after-school programs, I believe. Carla?
No, you did a great job with that, Michael. That's right.
I'll just say
Great.
that
Oh, go ahead.
I'll also send that Cassell report. If people want to email me that, I can pull it up pretty quickly and mail it off to folks. It's a good thing to show principals and other folks that even in this era of questioning about the effects of school-based mentoring, that it's about really what are the effects you want to get, because it's also about the same size as the effect of tutoring, but on different outcomes.
I was just going to add, Dr. Karcher, that if you want to send those things to me, to April, I can send them out to the whole group pretty easily.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
All right, so let's take one more question. We have another question from Ginny Babbitt about, has there been any research done on group mentoring in comparison to one-on-one for school-based mentoring programs for high school students? And if so, where can that be found?
I did conduct one study on group mentoring several years back, and at that time I had a really hard time finding any work on group mentoring, much less really rigorous impact studies on group mentoring. I haven't dived into that literature for a while, but I'm not aware of really solid studies in that area. Michael, you may know of some more recent work than I do.
No, in the next edition of the handbook, we're going to include a chapter on group and team mentoring, because there are increasingly programs, different kinds across the country, but there isn't much research on them.
In that study that I did, I can't remember if it was 2002, I can't remember what year it came out, but that is on the PPV website if anyone's interested in seeing that. Again, it was a very descriptive kind of exploratory study, but you might find ideas there that could lead you elsewhere.
And speaking of some of those additional resources, these are some of the resources. So if you go to, mostly I want to point out here that this last piece about this presentation is available at slideshare.net/training institute. So if you go to, and you can find that link on our website as well, or connections to our SlideShare account. So then if you get this presentation, then what's nice is that I do have some of the resources that are in the Mentors Research in Action there, so that you can just link directly to them instead of having to type in those links or things like that. And then one thing that we did add, because PPV wasn't listed as one of the resources on school-based mentoring, in the Mentor Research in Action brief, so that's here too. So some mentoring publications and mentoring initiatives. So if you go to PPV, then you could probably find that. You could find that group mentoring study there. Also, other pieces, this piece from the Mentor Consulting Group and Dr. Susan Weinberger, some pieces that the National Mentoring Partnership has, and including the elements of effective practice. So hearing that this Cassell study, or looking at how effect sizes grow when you add best practices. So that's obviously of great interest to us as mentoring programs, and particularly as our mentoring partnership launches looking at quality initiative. Also the Mentor Resource Center. So some of those questions about keeping mentoring relationships going during the summer months. There's a great fact sheet there, and also just some more about best practices for school-based mentoring. And then the Department of Education had a resource listed in the in Mentors Research and Action Brief, and then I also added the link though to the executive summary of their impact evaluation of student mentoring program. So you can read through that and certainly draw your own conclusions or get more detail on how their study was conducted and all of those things. And we are at 1 o'clock, so I wanted to make sure to let you know our next webinar is Wednesday, August 5th, same time, and we will be talking about cross-age peer mentoring. It's the next Research in Action brief, and again, featuring Dr. Michael Karcher and his research on cross-age peer mentoring. And just another plug, we've mentioned it several times, but Dr. Karcher will be at our conference in October, Monday, October 19th, doing not just a keynote, but also 2 workshops, one on school-based mentoring and one on cross-age peer mentoring, so we can dig into these topics even further with him. Any final thoughts from you, Dr. Karcher or Dr. Herrera? Anything you'd like to share at the end here? Thank you so much for participating.
You're very welcome. No, I think you did a great job, April.
You did a fantastic job. The only thing I would add is skip the executive summary of the DOE report and go straight to Appendix D.
Yeah. Read the full thing. If you really want to know what they found, read the full report. That's right.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We will email, do a follow-up email to everyone with some of the additional resources that were mentioned during the webinar, and feel free to, if your question didn't get answered or if there are other questions that you have, feel free to pass those along or be sure to come to the conference. Thanks a lot.